Go ahead and start that. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to run through some introductory slides that my colleague Kim May, who is with us today, is going to put together for level setting and orientation. So this again is the DB2 Connect Virtual Users Group. We're about a year old. We've had presentations by yours truly. We've had presentations from Kurt Kottner of Silicon Valley Lab, Melanie Stopfer of IBM Education, and today we have Adam Coyle and Marianne Ratoza who provide DB2 support. I am your moderator. Some housekeeping. Today's session is scheduled to run for 90 minutes. That's longer than usual. We just thought we had a lot of great material and wanted to make best use of everybody's time. Didn't want to run through it too quickly. All attendees' microphones will be muted for the duration of the webcast. We need to open those up later for discussion. We will, but probably handle feedback through the chat. Presentation slides are currently there on our blog right now, on the Fillmore Group's blog, on the URL that you see in the presentation materials. I understand from Adam that there have been some updates, so we'll have the latest and greatest up sometime after the webinar, either later today or tomorrow. We are not attempting to record. We are recording. I did some tests this morning, and it should be available. We'll post details about how to get the recording if you'd like to hear it again, share it with your friends, or post a viral video on YouTube. If you or a colleague would like to receive emails with information on upcoming DB2 Connect Virtual Users Group sessions, please contact my colleague Kim May. And many thanks to the volunteers, including and especially Marianne and Adam, for their hard work in preparing and delivering these sessions. Both of them have been working with Kim and me on and off for the last month or two to get all this ready, and I think you'll really enjoy their presentation today. If you would like a deeper dive on these topics, there are some upcoming classes, DB2 Connect class CF632, DB2 Connect 9 for DB2 for ZOS, problem determination and performance, is scheduled to be delivered on November 14th in our Towson, Maryland, USA classroom. The cost is $2,600 US and lasts for 4 days. There is a brand new class, the CL600, implementing DB2 Connect and client connections to DB2 for ZOS. That takes the place of the old CF602 class, which is being retired. The CL600 class is available for $1,300 and lasts 2 days and will be offered in December, February, and in April. Okay, and with that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters, whose bios I have in an email that I didn't wisely open up in advance of the session today. Adam Coyle is a subject matter expert on IBM DB2 security team. He began working as a level 2 DB2 technical support analyst in 2007 after graduating from DeVry, one of our other colleagues. Alex Wilson is also a DeVry grad. Marianne Ratoza is an advisory software engineer, has been with IBM for 27 years. Marianne has worked with DB2 for ZOS since 1990. For 18 years, she was DB2 for ZOS database administrator in both test and production environments, as well as DB2 systems programmer, and then joined the DB2 worldwide support team also in 2007. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Adam. Give me just a second. And there we go. You should be all set, Adam.
Terrific. Let me show that. So, thank you, Frank. I appreciate that. So today we're going to be talking about DB2 Connect and DB2 ZOS security. As Frank stated before, my name is Adam, and I have Mary, who is a colleague of mine and has helped on the ZOS side. We're going to be talking about the differences with DB2 UDB, version 9.1, version 9.5, and 9.7, and then also DB2 ZOS with security components. I wanted to focus on this presentation on a few different things. However, security is such a broad topic that I had to isolate it down to a few main components. And basically what we're going to focus on today is what is security to DB2 UDB, what are the involvement of parameters of configuration of DB2 UDB, and then also different types of other configuration along with Windows domain, extended security, and LDAP and transparent LDAP. And then Mary's going to follow up with ZOS side security. So going ahead on to the next slide, we talk about exactly what is DB2 security. In this topic, we're going to cover both DB2 and extended external security services. When thinking about security, there's two different main components. One being authentication, which is required by providing the user with a password, username and password, so that they can connect. And then the other one is authorization. Authorization has to do with specific actions that the user can do against the database via updating a table or doing a select on a table. And then with both of those being successful, DB2 will continue on and allow the user to do what it was allowed to do. So going forward, with the way DB2 works is we, on the UDB side, we rely completely on external external security functionality. Example is OS authentication, or LDAP, Kerberos is another option, SSL. So in that relation, we rely solely on the way the OS or LDAP handles the username and password versus how we handle it. And we use a process called DB2 check password to enable those features. Once we get that information back and it allows us to go forward, then we go into the group enumeration functionality and use authID to allow that information is stored additional for the life of the session, and then authID is what we use to determine what is the user able to do with inside the database for the UDB functionality. So we have a few different scenarios with Unix platforms on groups. You can only have up to 8 bytes or 8 characters, and they all have to be lowercase. However, on Windows, you can have up to 30 characters, and they can be mixed lowercase or uppercase, and that's both on the username and groups. However, they cannot start with or be user, admin, guest, public, local, SQL, and they can't begin with IBM SQL or sys for purposes of the way we communicate. For password length, in 9.1 we had a limitation where on Linux and Unix you were not allowed to go over 8 characters. That has since been lifted into 9.5 and 9.7, and no matter what OS you're on, the maximum characters are whatever is allowed by the actual OS. However, on Windows for 9.1, we only allowed 14 characters. We did have a scenario that we ran into a few weeks ago where somebody was using a password with MD5, and they were on 9.1 AIX 5.1.5.3. In that scenario, they were receiving a 30082 reason code 24, and the reason why that was occurring was because of the way MD5 was working with encryption, and we since allow MD5 compatibility, but only for 9.1, but only in AIX 6.1 and higher. So going on to the next slide, we have two different types of the way DB2 UDB works. You have authentication from the database manager configuration parameter setting, and then also the DB2 catalog for the client side, which would be authentication as well. If you're using a gateway going to a mainframe, you would have to specify both the authentication type and the DBM CFG parameter along with the catalog information as well. An example of updating the database manager configuration file would be setting it to server, which is by default. To do that, you would first, to list what was set, you would type in DB2 get DBM CFG, and that would dump out our parameter settings. Upon that, you could tell whether the authentication was set to server, server encrypt, client, and a few other options that we'll go over here shortly. Once you have the parameter that you would like to change, you go ahead and issue a DB2 update DBM CFG using authentication, and then the parameter, in this example, it's server. You would then issue a DB2 stop, which would recycle DB2 and bring it back up online. If DB2 doesn't get recycled, we won't pick up the new authentication type until the next time DB2 is recycled. So you can go ahead and set it and then schedule an outage for 4 or 5 hours later, and then once that outage has been taken, been in place, and DB2 has been brought down successfully and brought back up successfully, we will implement the new authentication type. So going on, we have several different types of authentication that you can use, and this goes for also when cataloging a database, which we'll go over shortly. You have server, server encrypt AES. All three of those, along with data encrypt, rely solely on the server to authenticate the user. Client obviously would rely on the client to authenticate the user, not the server. With AES and server encrypt, the username and password are both encrypted. I'm sorry, AES encrypts both the username and password. Server encrypt only encrypts password. Data encrypt encrypts everything that goes through from the client to the server. And then additional we have, which isn't on here, is Kerberos, which is a third-party authentication protocol that would enable additional security protocols. So going on, here's an example of how to set up from a client perspective of doing the cataloging through authentication. Normally you would issue a catalog. You would first catalog the node to point to where we're going inside the network for the host name, port, and then the actual node name as well. Once that is done, we need to catalog the database. In this example, it would be cataloged database sample. And then you could do as whatever database alias you want to make it. That is optional. However, the next portion is not, which is at node. And then whatever the node name that you previously set. And then last, for authentication, you would type in authentication and then the desired authentication type. In this case, it would be server. Once that's issued, you need to do a DB2 terminate to refresh the cache. This does not bring down DB2. It just refreshes the cache daemons that DB2 has so that you can connect to the database successfully. If you don't do this and you issue a DB2 connect to the database name, there's a possibility you'll either encounter a security error, which would be security 30082, reason code 24, which could complain of a mismatch, or you could get a communication error. For common communication errors, which would be 30081, we recommend that you issue on the server side DB2 set. Make sure that com equals TCP is set on that side, and that's the actual command that you would set that. And then also make sure that in the DBM CFG parameter, service name is set to a specific port that you set the node port number to as well. And then also make sure that the instance is up and running and that that port is actively listening through a netstat -an. So why would you want to specify the authentication type on both the client and or server? The reason for this is to improve in performance through the DB2 connect, through the client, and then to allow different types of authentication to be used. It just cuts down on the communication time. If it's not set, the DB2 client will go through a process. First, by default, DB2 encrypt. If the server isn't set to that, then the client will retry with another connection or authentication type. However, on mainframes, they can support multiple different types of authentication. For example, client, server, server encrypt, and Kerberos all at the same time, simultaneously. So the client could come in with any number of different types of authentication, and to get the correct one, it's recommended that you actually do set this. So in order for DB2 to issue a send the username and password, we use the process called DB2 check password daemon, which is spawned by the DB2 sysc, which is our main DB2 process. Inside this process, we hold the username and password and rely on it to send the information to the OS for verification and to go forward. Upon connection to DB2 sysc, it spawns a DB2 agent. Then the agent then spawns a username and password, and validation of the password and username is validated, is successful, and authentication is done via the DB2 sysc. Once that's all validated, the DB2 agent will proceed with group enumeration and go forward from there.
Adam, as you're switching screens, just a quick orientation question for my own benefit. I just want to verify that everything that you're describing when you talk about DB2 also applies to DB2 Connect Personal Edition and DB2 Connect Enterprise Edition, or the gateway topology. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. All this applies to the way DB2 Connect works as well. I'm here typing. Okay, so going on to the next slide. Going on to the next slide, we have DB2 check password daemon, which controls the number of daemons that we spawn out. Prior to 9.5, setting it to 0 was a option that, when facing any kind of memory problems with AIX, you could set it to 0 and we wouldn't spawn any agents. Since v9.5, we've started issuing what is called a 3 minus fork, which is equivalent to 0. So if you set that to 0, it's going to do the 3 fork. By default, DB2 check password daemon is set to 3 for any environment in any previous. If you're typing, can you please stop? Thank you. So we're forking the process. When forking the process, we're creating a separate daemon. Upon that daemon, we will terminate that daemon once the authentication goes through, and we will go forward with authentication.
Adam, my apology.
So going forward with Windows, your problem. No problem. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Adam. Just while you were switching screens, my apology. I've muted everybody but you, so you should be the only one that we hear from now on.
Okay, great. Thank you. With Windows authentication, there's a few different types. We have domain and local authentication, then domain and local group numeration, and also extended security to DB2. So we're going to go over, those are the 3 main topics that we're going to cover with Windows. The first one is with Windows authentication, Windows authentication. You have 2 in a domain environment. You have the primary domain controller, and then you also have a backup domain controller. Both contain a database called Security Access Manager, which is called SAM by short. SAM contains both the groups and also the passwords and usernames that are shown, that are kept inside this database. It also records members of a domain, and then records other domain and trusted domain. The backup is pretty much the same thing, just a backup of it. It holds the same information, and in case of any kind of failover, it would pick up for the primary control domain. So in a group groups are maintained in the SAM database. There's 2 types of groups. There's a local group and a domain group. The local group stores the SAM information, or is stored on the Windows machine and stores in the machine where the SAM database is. On a local or on a global group, defines on a domain controller. It contains any user accounts for domain SAM, and then also holds any primary SAM domains. no local groups for the DC. All users and groups are for the domain. So rule of thumb, in the order a user, or in order of looking up a user, you have local machine, you have a domain controller, and then you have trusted domain as well. After authentication is done, validated and has been validated, the user ID and password, DB2 will proceed with group enumeration. In this example, we have basically a single domain environment where test machine A would be a DB2 Connect client, and then machine B could be DB2 Connect Server Edition or ESE, and then machine C is where the domain in the domain controller is held. So what we would do is we would issue the domain ID on machine A to machine B, and then machine B would send that information over to machine C for verification. DB2 on machine DB2 is on machine B. It searches the local SAM, and then if it can't verify that, it would go to machine C for verification. And this can be changed through the DB2 group lookup environment variable as well, if you wanted it to go strictly to domain versus starting at machine B and then going to machine C. And we'll talk about that here shortly. So group enumeration, always on the machine where the user is defined at, happens first. DB2 authenticates the user in this order. It looks up the user on the local machine. If it can't find it there, then it'll go to its own domain controller. And if it can't find it there, then it'll go to, it'll look it up onto a trusted domain environment. This can be circumvented through the DB2 lookup command, group lookup environment variable, and you can specify local domain, and then there's also token and token domain. So here's these are the examples of actual of local and domain users and what these environments variables do when they're associated with the DB2 group lookup environment. And then in addition, we have token domain, and token local. Whenever you specify either local or domain, it's recommended that you also specify domain, token domain or token local, and those would be associated with its counterpart. Domain would be token domain, and local would be token local. And then these are pretty much the same things that this is just going further into the token environment and what they do. So going forward, we're limiting access when it comes to the group lookup. Access token is used against the user connection connecting to the database only. For example, if a fenced stored procedure is running under a fenced ID, access to the token cannot be used for the fenced user. The best practice, like I said before, when you're setting either local or token or I'm sorry, local or domain, it's customary to also set token local or token domain as well. So when setting up DB2 with a domain environment, it's recommended that you have these rights performed underneath that user. For example, read group membership, SAM, and so on. There is a common problem that we see when it comes to environments that have domain IDs being used, and that's where the DB2 dialog will report an OS error called access denied OS, I believe it's 5, access denied. To get rid of that, it's a warning message, and it doesn't cause any problems with domain or with DB2. But to correct that action, it's recommended that you start the main DB2 process as a domain ID versus a local account on that machine in question. So with Windows, you have the sysadm group, which is also available on Windows or Linux and Unix as well, which is found inside the dbmcfg parameter. The members in local administrator group, if a user is a local administrator. Members in a domain administrator group, if their user is a domain account, and then if you have extended security, which we'll talk about shortly, there's members of the DB2 administrative group or DB2 admins group, defined locally or globally. So an overview to override the sysadm group, you can create a local group on the DB2 server and set that group to the sysadm group, and set the group enumeration to be local on that machine. So it'll look locally first and only locally. If you wanted it to go global, you would create a domain group and set that domain group to specify in the sysadm group. With DB2 UDB, you can have groups inside groups, and we can see down that level for permissions and privileges on a database.
Adam, this is Frank.
So looking at, yeah.
I'm sorry, for no other reason than to just give you the opportunity to catch a breath or get a drink of water. You've been doing great, and you're making great progress on the slides. So I think we're tracking at a very good pace in terms of the depth that you're going on with each slide. There's a lot of backup detail. At this point, I wanted to remind everyone the session is being recorded, and that it will be available for later playback for your colleagues. The second thing is that if there are any questions that are coming up, you're welcome to go ahead and put those in the chat now. We won't address them until later, but if you think of something as Adam is going through the presentation, you can go ahead and add it to the chat, and then as a moderator later, I'll read those back to Adam and give him the opportunity to speak on them. But I wanted to let everybody know that that facility exists. It's a little bit further down on the GoToWebinar control panel. So go ahead, Adam. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Frank. I appreciate that. So going forward, in order to find out what type of group you're a member of, there's a few different methods that you can do. For example, you can do list group for auth ID, which is a table functionality, and you would have to be connected to the database to do that. There's also DB2 get authorization, which actually has been deprecated in 9.5. and we recommend that you use the auth list authorization for ID to get that information of that particular ID. And then there's specific OS commands that you can do. For example, you can do net user and then the username, net local group, and that'll list all the groups, and so on and so on. So for an example of using the auth list group for auth ID functionality, you would do select star from table, and then this specific stored procedure. It's an actual system stored procedure, and you would list that out, and then the specific user ID that you're looking or targeting. In this example, it would be test, and it came back. This user ID test is a member of both DB2 users, the DB2 admins group, and then administrator group as well. So we have also, in addition to domain environments, you can also enable something called extended security with DB2. However, this option is not available in the IBM Data Server client, runtime client, or the IBM driver client as well. And it is enabled by default upon install of DB2. If you do not want it, you have to make sure that you uncheck that box while installing DB2. And once DB2 Extended Security is enabled, it will create two groups called DB2 Admins and DB2 Users Group. You can rename these groups or set them to domain groups if you prefer upon install, and I'll show you where that's at in the next slide. If you want to do a silent install via response file, you would have to issue those commands inside the response file itself. And it'll give you more choices. Also choose to use the groups that already exist on the system as well. So when enabling extended security, you would see an example of this enabled is to your right. You should note that this does not take the place of or give levels as such as sys ADM group, sysmain, and syscontrol, which is additional groups that DB2 has inside itself for privileges and permissions specific to the database itself. All this does is allow for DB2 to give itself the correct privileges inside Windows with read-write access and folder options as well. So going forward with extended security, you have the DB2 admins group, which is full control of all DB2 objects, and then you also have the DB2 users group, which has read and execute on all DB2 objects, but can't delete or modify any of the actual files inside DB2. So if you want to change your computer name, in some environments that has been done, it is recommended that you issue this command after restart of the computer, and it's as follows: db2 ext esc -a, and then the new computer name, group, the DB2 admins group, or whatever you specified, and then -u for the users, the new group name, and then the new computer name, and the name, and then DB2 users group or whatever has been set in your environment. So in order to say you want to remove this option later down the road, you can. However, it's recommended that you actually uninstall and reinstall DB2 for it to completely negate any kind of prior settings with DB2. You can issue the DB2 EC -R command to remove it. However, that could have adverse side effects, and the best course of action and best practice would be to actually remove any and all files associated with DB2, including the database directory. You could take a backup of that database and then restore it later, and that should still not hold the extended security information that was previously set in that environment. So going forward, we earlier in the slides we were talking about LDAP, which is also another common setting that we see here in support. And you have two different types of LDAP. You have LDAP plugin authentication, which is supported starting in 9.1 Fixpak 6, and then you also have transparent LDAP. Transparent LDAP is a little bit less overhead from the DB2 perspective, and only requires a few minor steps within DB2 to enable it, but requires a few more steps outside of DB2. With plugins, you have the IBM LDAP Security INI setup, and then enabling the plugin itself that you've created inside the DBM CFG parameters. So talking about supported OSs and supported LDAP products, this is current as of version 9.7. We offer support on plugins for LDAP and also on transparent LDAP as of AIX 5.3.5.2 for plugins. And then we also offer support for HP, Unix, Linux, Solaris 9 and 10, and then Windows 2000 through Windows 2008. And then supported LDAP products that we have actually, we have the Lotus domain LDAP server, Lotus Tivoli directory server, which we're seeing quite a bit more in, and then Microsoft Active Directory, Novell, and Open LDAP, and Sun, and then ZOS as well. So when we're talking about plugins, you have to have the user defined inside the plugin or inside the LDAP server. You can't have them defined locally. However, with transparent LDAP, that's not the case. You can have them defined locally, and then it's up to the NSS switch to decide whether it should go local or go to the LDAP server for authentication, along with the way the OS is set up to handle that. That also goes for the fact of all groups must be defined inside the LDAP server. They cannot be defined locally on the database server itself. You have three different types of plugins. You have client, server, and group. All three should be set according to the way you want the authentication to occur. So if client plugin is set, then validation of the user ID and password supplied by the client on connect and attach occurs on the client machine, and the DB2 server needs to be configured with authentication equals to client, or SRV con underscore auth equals client. It needs to be set as well if authentication isn't set to client. If a server a plugin is enabled, then validation of the user ID occurs on the LDAP server itself, and to the DB2 authorization ID. And if group plugin is set, then the authentication occurs inside the group of whatever that user is specified under. Is generally pulled from the LDAP server itself. So in relation to the plugin modules that you have to set, you also have to modify the LDAP or IBM LDAP security.ini file, which is included in all installs of DB2, and is found underneath your current install path and then the directory called CFG. For some parameters, we have a few set here. There's additional ones that were not included in this presentation due to the fact of time, but you have server values, which would be specific to the port number and host name. You have enable SSL, SSL key file, and SSL password to enable SSL functionality. You also have user defined values, and these are based on whatever you have the user set up as. In addition to these values, along with the group values, there's also another one that's kind of important. It's for debugging purposes. If you need to debug LDAP via the plugin modules, it's recommended that you update the diaglobal to 4 and then set inside the IBM's LDAP security.ini file the debug option to true in order to enable the debug option to go forward. And then in order to enable the plugin functionality to go forward, you would have to update the actual DBM CFG parameter, and these are examples of that being enabled. And then lastly, we have transparent LDAP. And transparent LDAP, basically, like I said before, it's a lot less overhead from a DB2 perspective. It does require a few more things from the OS and from the LDAP perspective, but from a DB2 perspective, all you need to do is set the DB2 set environment variable DB2 auth equals OS auth DB, and then also update update the authentication to your desired authentication, either server encrypt or data encrypt. And you also have to make sure that you are not using any plug-in modules associated with the plug-in environment variables or database manager configuration settings. And by default, it's always set to null, and that you set those all to null, and then restart the instance. And these links that are here, that are outlined inside this document or this presentation, which I'm underlining right now, are links that will take you to our information center, and we'll talk more specifically to each particular OS and the steps that you need for those environments. But for any environment, the steps of setting the DB2 auth and then the authentication variables and making sure that the plugins are not enabled goes for any environment that that is set up. And if this isn't set up correctly, the chances of DB2 not being able to communicate correctly with LDAP could result and have resulted in either a crash or a hang. And most of the time those hangs and crashes occur outside of DB2 code, and usually involve either the LDAP server itself or the way the OS is handling the LDAP server and the communication between the two. And with that, I will hand it over to Mary and let her talk about the ZOS side.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. I thought that was wonderful, and having worked with this technology for over 20 years, I learned a lot, especially the LDAP piece. I've had a lot of questions on it before and never implemented it, so it was good for you to give us that overview. So at this point, I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to introduce Marianne Ratosa. Again, a reminder, if there are any questions that come up regarding the presentation, if you want to go ahead and put those in the chat, that'll give you the opportunity to ask questions or get clarifications. And with that, Marianne, it's all yours.
Okay. Let's see. Frank, I'm trying to get the screen to come up here. Let's see here.
Marianne, you want to do the screen show? Just click on slideshow at the top.
Yeah.
That's what you're looking for. And start from current slide. Keep going. It's right across the top. View, insert, format tools, and then slideshow.
Yeah, I don't have that.
I'm looking at it on your screen right now. It says slideshow. We're looking at your screen. If you go up just a skosh, about a half an inch now, come across to the right, about 3 inches. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Stop. Slideshow. Right there.
Oh.
Hit that pull down.
I can't see the pull down from mine.
Do you just want to do it from mine?
Yeah, it's probably easier, Adam.
I'll flip back to Adam then. Thank you, Adam.
Okay, just tell me when to go to the next.
Yeah, I still can't see the screen, though, for that. That's what's bothering me here. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, see, I can't get back to, I can see it, but I can't get rid of this screen here.
You should be able to bring up you can just flip through your slide presentation for orientation. We're not looking at your desktop now. We're looking at Adam's.
We'll do that. Okay, Adam, so DB2 for ZOS basic terminology is the 4LM1. So what I'm going to do, I'm not going to go through a lot of the security details for ZOS, just some basics for some problems that we have that are common when people try to connect to ZOS and use especially the encryption security types. So one of the big differences is with DB2 for ZOS, it is a subsystem that runs on the ZOS operating system. You can have multiple DB2 subsystems on a ZOS image. So it's not one-to-one relationship. The other thing you can have is DB2 can be a standalone subsystem, or it can be a member of a DB2 data sharing group. The data sharing group would come into play when you use things like the Sysplex workload balancing. When you do that, you're connecting to a DB2 data sharing group, and there can be 1, 2, 5, or 10 members of a data sharing group. So it's good to know where you're connecting to, and if you're using the group or if you're using just a specific member for your connection. The other big difference, DB2 for ZOS has multiple databases. A lot of time people will say, you know, I'm connecting to this database, but for DB2 Connect language and DB2 for ZOS language, it's different. A database is underneath the subsystem. And then each database, of course, would contain its multiple objects, the tables, the indexes, and the data. Again, when you connect to ZOS, you connect to a subsystem or a data sharing group. Okay, Adam, next one. The next foil should be what you need to know when you connect to DB2 for ZOS. Basically, if you do a display DDF command on the DB2 for ZOS subsystem, it will give you all the information you need to configure your connection. It'll give you the location, which I have highlighted in blue. It'll give you the TCP port, which is your SQL well-known port. That's the port that you need to connect into. It'll also give you the SQL domain name, which is, Adam, I believe you configure that when you set up the database.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. You can use the domain name. You can use the IP address. Typically, we prefer the domain name. Okay, next slide. The authentication and security. DB2 for ZOS, when you pass a user ID and password, we issue a call to IBM RACF or whatever other OEM security software you may be running, like Computer Associates Top Secret, for example. So DB2 doesn't authenticate the password. We call RACF or the security software to do the authentication. And the rules for your password and user ID are based on your security software's rules. When the client goes to connect to DB2 for ZOS, there's like negotiation that's done. If you request a type of security that DB2 for ZOS does not support, you will get back an error message, an SQL code saying that, you know, we don't support that type of security. Request a different type. For example, you cannot connect to DB2 for ZOS using just a user ID. You have to pass a user ID and password typically for TCP/IP connections. Once you're authenticated to ZOS and to the subsystem, authorization within DB2, there's two ways that can be done. It can be managed by DB2 with grants. It can also be handled by the external security product, which would mean RACF security groups and classes. And then the authorizations are given by adding the user IDs to those different classes. We have similar security to DB2 Connect in regards to the sysadm, sysopper, sysdb control, sysdb atom. The different levels will give you different granularity to what you can do in the subsystem and to what you can see as far as data and what objects you can work with. It can be on a database level, it can be on a subsystem level, it can be on a table level. Next one, Adam, please. Sending encrypted passwords from workstation clients. This is probably one area we see the most issues in. If you plan on using encrypted information and you want to use AES security, it's very important to know that on the ZOS subsystem, you need hardware and software enabled in order to use AES. There's something known as ICSF, which is it's called crypto software and hardware. Depending on the model of the processor you're running will depend what type of hardware you need. The software for the crypto also has to be installed. That is things like master keys for encryption. If you do not have that configured correctly and you attempt to use AES encryption, you will get back SQL code from the DB2 ZOS server showing a failure. It may not be very clear why it failed. If you check the DB2 for ZOS logs, there are often messages that are issued stating that the AES encryption or the ICSF software is not configured. Let's see, next foil, Adam. Here's more on the AES encryption and the ICSF. Your hardware and software requirements for the particular processor are documented in the ICSF Administration Guide. They go through, and for every security API that requires the cryptographic processor, it tells you what specific hardware component is needed based on the different model of processor you're running. Next foil, Adam. A lot of customers, when they go to use AES using the JDBC driver, they don't realize that they need a certain policy file in place that will use the stronger encryption values for the 256-bit AES encryption. This is documented in the DB2 for ZOS administration guide. And there are links included here which tells you where to get those stronger encryption policy files. And they're actually called unrestricted policy file. If you attempt AES encryption and do not have the policy file, the correct policy file, you will get back a SQL code that indicates I believe it says the password is invalid. But if you're attempting to use AES, it's one thing to check. Make sure you have the correct policy file. Next foil, Adam, please. Here's just some information. This is basically what Adam has showed about the encrypted user and data security. If you wish to use the encrypted data, the sensitive data, there are only certain things that actually get encrypted. SQL statements, the input and output parameter information, result sets, log data, XML data, and results of described operations. Again, if you're going to use encrypted data, you need the AES security and the ICSF facility installed and configured in order to do that. Next foil. This is on the LDAP setup for DB2 ZOS. I didn't go through the details. There's quite a few steps to enable the LDAP server and the RACF security. In our administration guide, there are the steps outlined for each particular step you have to take. So, for example, the first thing you have to do is you have to configure the LDAP server. There's about 8 or 10 steps in order to do that. Once you have your LDAP server configured, the next thing you have to do is you have to set up RACF for the identity mapping. And then you have to grant DB2 authority in order for RACF to use the map-in plugin service. These steps are outlined in the admin guide. After you do those first 2 steps, you need to use the RACF, the IBM RACF identity mapping admin utility to configure the identity mapping domain controller. And this is another, I believe there's 5 or 6 steps in this process. After you finish those, the final step would be to add the SAF user mapping plugin to the linked list data set on the ZOS where the DB2 is running. So it's not complicated. It's quite entailed, though, and there's several steps, and you want to make sure if you're going to use this that every step is followed for each of the different sections in the admin guide. And then for reference, next foil, Adam, I included a link for the DB210 for ZOS Info Center homepage, and as well as the DB291 Info Center homepage. Off the Info Center homepages for DB2Z, there is a lot of information that are really good references. In addition to your standard sets of DB2 manuals and documentation, there's the Developer Works links. There's a link to red books. There's a link to white papers. There's a lot of good information that can be found out there if you plan on using the different types of security from the DB2 Connect clients into DB2Z. We also support the Kerberos. We also support pass tickets, and we support trusted contacts. All of the setup steps are well documented in our manuals. You know, it's just important to make sure you follow all the different steps. There's also a red book, DB2 for ZOS, Distributed Functions, which has a lot of good information about the different connectivity options you can get from DB2 Connect into the ZOS server, the DB2 for ZOS server. But then that is written for DB2 version 9. That's all I had for the ZOS side.
Thank you, Mary. In closing, I have put together for one of my last slides some helpful tech docs that we see common problems on the LUW side, along with additional developer workbench documentation that's also on here. And without these people, Connie Lamb, George Markovich, Mary, and then me, we wouldn't be able to present this. And I just wanted to show my appreciation and thank all of them for their contributions to this presentation. And we'll open it up for questions if that's okay with Frank.
That sounds terrific, Adam, and thank you both, Adam and Marianne, for an excellent job. You covered a lot of material in a very measured pace, a lot of good information, a lot of stuff I didn't know, and all the references are very welcome because, you know, these things are like wormholes. You start to go down and say, well, I want to enable LDAP. Well, what does that mean? Well, there are a lot of steps, and you guys have given us a hunting license now to go find all of the different pieces that we need in order to make it work. But we're hearing about these things more and more complex environments. So the days when you set up RACF and that's all you needed to worry about, those days are gone. So wonderful job. Thank you both very much. I have not received any chat messages, so I'm just going to assume that you guys did such a wonderful job that there were no outstanding questions. If anybody is having a problem with the chat, if you could raise your hand using the GoToWebinar tool, I can check to see if there are any folks. Let me see. Annette Mormon, do you have a question? Let me go ahead and take you off mute. If you have a microphone handy, why don't you go ahead and ask us what your question is.
Hi, can you send us the slide presentation?
The slide presentation is going to be set up on the Fillmore Group's blog. There is actually one out there now, and that is going to be supplemented with some revisions that Adam made just before the webcast went live. The entire webcast itself will also be on, posted in a way that you can review it if you want to go back through it again or you want to point some colleagues to it.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome. And William Bailey, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question for us? I'm not hearing you, William. If you have your microphone enabled. I tell you what, we're going to come back to William in a second. And right now, that is all the questions that we have. So I'm going to, are you there, William? Okay. So I tell you what, this does not end your ability to communicate with us. Once we get the webinar posted on our blog, on the Fillmore Group's blog, you can go ahead and post comments there and ask questions as well, and we'll try to get back to you that way. So if anything comes up after the presentation, please take advantage of that. The Fillmore Group's blog is in the materials that you were sent and also should have been available in the invitations that you've received. Again, I'd like to thank Adam Coyle, Marianne Ratoz, and my colleague Kim May for putting this all together. There's a relatively small group of folks that vet topics and set all this up, and we'd like to have others join us. If you have a user experience or you have a case study that you'd like to present from, or if you're another IBMer, please reach out to Kim. Her email address is kim.may@thefillmoregroup.com. and we'll be happy to have your assistance. Thank you very much again. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now and shut down the webinar. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.